For thousands of years, humans consumed mood-altering plant-based substances within mostly localized, tolerable limits. But as the 20th century progressed, chemical technology introduced a new variable: synthetic and highly refined narcotics. These powerful compounds defied geographic boundaries, establishing international supply chains that local authorities could not contain. A state could easily regulate the cultivation of a local crop. It could not, however, unilaterally dismantle an illicit logistical network that manufactured a synthetic compound in one hemisphere, laundered the profits in another, and distributed the product across dozens of distinct jurisdictions. This United Nations paper outlines the severity of the problem. As the illicit trade grew into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, it brought severe secondary effects. We see explicit references to wide-scale bribery of public officials and the rapid spread of AIDS. Sovereign nations found themselves outmatched. A single country attempting to ban these substances at its borders was effectively trying to stop a global tide with a local dam. The cartels simply rerouted shipments to weaker entry points. Isolated enforcement policies fail against a borderless economy. To address a globally distributed supply chain, the international community realized it had to construct a globally coordinated regulatory architecture. Early 20th century treaties focused primarily on tracking the legal shipment of medical opium and cocaine. By the late 1980s, that ad hoc treaty system was buckling under the weight of sophisticated, well-funded criminal organizations. The turning point occurred at the 1987 Vienna Conference. Recognizing that fragmented policies were failing, member states gathered to draft a comprehensive, unified doctrine for international law. The strategy formalized here explicitly defined a balanced approach built on 4 distinct operational pillars. First, the reduction of illicit demand. Second, control over legitimate supply. Third, the suppression of illicit trafficking. And fourth, the treatment and rehabilitation of users. These 4 pillars form the complete architectural framework for international drug control. To understand how the global system operates today, we have to look closely at how each of these pillars is engineered to function. The logic behind this structure is straightforward. If a government cracks down on supply but ignores the demand of millions of active users, the resulting scarcity simply drives up prices, making the black market even more profitable. A successful system requires pressure on every point of the cycle simultaneously. Looking at this structural model, the first pillar is illicit demand reduction. The core premise is economic. Law enforcement cannot eliminate a product if a highly lucrative consumer base continues to pay for it. Reducing demand requires a state-level logistical effort. Governments must first establish accurate assessment systems to quantify the exact scale of local drug use, followed immediately by targeted interventions directly inside the workplace. This United Nations strategy brief outlines the primary defensive tactics required. It explicitly mandates prevention through education, prioritizing structured programs run by civic organizations and community groups before the user ever encounters the illicit market. The UN designates specific agencies to handle these tasks. This document identifies the role of UNESCO, which is tasked with producing audio-visual materials and running teacher training seminars to operationalize this public education on a global scale. Demand reduction acts as the prerequisite for the entire control system. Without it, arresting dealers or seizing shipments only creates a temporary supply vacuum, which the enduring demand will quickly fill with new suppliers. The second pillar, licit supply control, deals with a built-in contradiction. The world relies on the aggressive suppression of illicit narcotics, but medical science requires a massive, uninterrupted supply of those exact same chemical compounds for anesthesia and pain management. The legal foundation for balancing these conflicting needs is found in treaties like the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961. This text outlines the codification of international laws to regulate the cultivation of plants used as raw materials for natural narcotic drugs. To enforce this treaty, the UN established a central monitoring mechanism known as the International Narcotics Control Board, or INCB. The INCB implements strict measures of quantitative control across all member states. To make this work, the system imposes a rigid quota protocol. Every nation must furnish detailed mathematical estimates of its medical and scientific needs for the upcoming year. By compiling these national estimates, the INCB maintains a legally binding global ledger. They act as the chief accountant for the planet's legitimate drug supply, strictly limiting pharmaceutical manufacturing to match exactly what is needed for hospitals and labs, preventing excess stock from bleeding into the black market. Once the legal supply is accounted for, the system turns to the illicit market. This is the third pillar, trafficking suppression. Traditional local policing is useless against transnational cartels. Dismantling these networks requires states to adopt aggressive, innovative judicial tactics. The UN strategy lists precise legal tools for disruption. Item 2 promotes controlled deliveries to identify final buyers. Item 3 demands international extradition. It also requires laws for immediate forfeiture of financial proceeds, alongside intense surveillance of international mail routes. Pillar 3 treats drug trafficking as a hostile, multinational logistical enterprise. The goal is to systematically dismantle every node of that enterprise, stripping the cartels of their money, their transport routes, and their immunity from prosecution. The final component addresses the inevitable endpoint of the drug economy. This is Pillar 4, treatment and rehabilitation. This text shows how the responsibilities are divided. The International Labor Organization focuses its resources on the vocational rehabilitation of dependent persons, while the World Health Organization plays an integral role in establishing the actual treatment and medical management protocols. If dependent users are simply imprisoned and released without rehabilitation, their addiction drives them directly back to the illicit market. That cycle of returning demand actively undermines the billions of dollars spent by governments on border enforcement and supply quotas. Looking at the complete diagram, we can see that these 4 pillars are not isolated lists. They form a tightly coupled, interdependent matrix where a failure in one quadrant immediately impacts the others. If a government pours all its funding into border enforcement but fails to implement demand reduction, it accidentally creates a highly profitable environment. The remaining drugs become incredibly valuable, incentivizing more sophisticated and ruthless traffickers to enter the market. Conversely, if regulators ignore the quotas on the illicit supply chain, massive quantities of high-grade, legally manufactured pharmaceutical narcotics will inevitably be diverted into the black market to meet that exact same demand. To keep this complex machine running, overarching bodies dictate the international agenda. This document details the hierarchy, highlighting the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, or CND, as the central policymaking body within the UN system. The CND sits at the top of the architecture. Its purpose is to review the global situation and issue recommendations, attempting to keep the deeply disparate legal efforts of sovereign states perfectly aligned within the 4-pillar framework. A common geopolitical misconception is that the United Nations acts as a global police force. In reality, it possesses zero direct law enforcement authority on the ground. The system functions entirely through administrative coordination, the gathering of global data, the calculation of quotas, and persistent diplomatic persuasion. The ultimate bottleneck is sovereignty. The Vienna framework relies completely on individual nations to voluntarily draft and enforce domestic laws that mirror the UN's directives. If a state refuses, or lacks the institutional capacity to act, the global network remains vulnerable. The international scenario represents a century-long systems engineering challenge, requiring the constant calibration of domestic laws, medical science, and global economics. The system is imperfect, and cartel logistics constantly evolve. However, navigating the intersection of potent synthetic chemistry, rigid sovereign borders, and international public health requires a coordinated structure. The balanced approach provides the necessary architectural blueprint.